Recently, IBM and AFCEA hosted the annual SPADE Defense Conference in Berlin and Washington, D.C. The day-long event focused on the theme, delivering on the vision for multi-domain and joint all-domain command and control. In the first half of this special SPADE edition, I welcome Len Bastien, CIO of Canada's Department of National Defense, and Terry Halvorsen, former CIO at the U.S. Department of Defense, now General Manager, IBM Federal Solutions, and the host of this year's SPADE conference. So, Len, would you tell us more about your responsibilities?
So, again, back to the job description for a CIO at Defense. We are the implementers, if you will, of digital equities. So the way our department is structured, the department has three implementers. You have your infrastructure, real property implementer who builds the buildings, the bricks and mortar stuff. We have a materiel implementer who buys the platforms, the weapons, the boots and bullets, as they say. And then you have us. And we take care of all digitally enabled capabilities for the Canadian Armed Forces and the department. And so that encompasses everything from intelligence to space to command and control, which is why this job description is different than most other CIO jobs.
Now I'd like to bring Terry and you into the conversation together. So Terry, perhaps you could start us off here with the definition of multi-domain command and control. Could you tell us more about that? And then Len, I'd love for you to follow up.
So multi-domain, what that really translates to is if you buy into the premise, and I do, and I think we're finding more of the defense groups do, that data today has become critically more important. And the aspects of data that you have to manage, how do you get data to the right commander at the right time? How do you take full advantage of the data you collect? Today, if we're really kind, maybe defense around the world, maybe we use anywhere from 10 to 15% of all the data we collect. So that means 85% of what you have is digital waste. If you can reduce that number, and so where you're using maybe even 50% of your data, and you can move that data or move the results of that data, and we'll get into a little bit about what the subtlety is about moving data or moving the results, that's a big warfare advantage. And the ability to change your command and control as the battle changes or as the geopolitical environment that you're prepping for changes is a key advantage in warfare. And it's a key advantage in business too, the speed to decision, but more impactful in warfare. So that's really what multi-domain is about. How do you get decision quality data to the commanders? How do you then enable them to get their decisions out to the units that they need to faster, more securely? And the third part of this, less important than the first two, but certainly a consideration, and do that with fiscal responsibility. So you're not overburdening it with cost.
So to segue to what Terry just said, let me add some Canadian context. Data and information is so valuable, such a force multiplier, that we've created an office, and we call it Combat Systems Integration. So we're now referring to information and data as a combat system. And they've taken a lead role for us in establishing sort of the high-level requirements for digital. So when you get to the what is multi-domain, all-domain, it's the same question, and it's met with the same curiosity as what is digital. It can have many definitions. So back to my comment about a modern NORAD or continental defense being everything from submarines to satellites. Just count the domains you're going through to get from a submarine to a satellite. And the information has to flow. And one of the things I do, so as an assistant, so I'm a CIO, which allows me to be part of the defense team. And I said earlier, I get to implement capabilities that benefits operators in the armed forces, which is a lot of fun. The other part of my job, the assistant deputy minister part of the job, is providing advice to government. And I have to speak about these things in very layman terms because ministers, elected officials, even sometimes deputy ministers aren't experts in the IT or digital realm. So you have to kind of translate. And one of the analogies I use to translate multi-domain or all-domain, I said, because I happen to have a deputy who's a bit of a movie buff. And in the vintage 2014, there was a Fast and Furious, and they talked about a capability, and they used it in the movie called God's Eye. And if you go back, you'll remember that was just it was like a hack capability that you could find anybody anywhere in the world because it was all open source. The data was this powerful computer could run around and scour up all the data and crunch it for you, and within minutes could find you the answer to your question. So if you can imagine an operator being able to do that, you are sitting on the essence of what all domain capability needs to be. The future of the warfighter isn't going to be specific to any one domain. And so it's interesting that Hollywood was able to tease us and open our imaginations. And I think the journey towards what all domain requirements are going to be maybe started with a couple of armed forces officers who saw that movie and decided, you know what, that would be a powerful weapon.
I want to know about the Canada story with vis-a-vis implementing and its journey towards multi-domain and why it's so important.
Yeah, thanks. Good question. Not easy to answer.
Is it because it's in its infancy, or is it not? It's matured and.
Yeah, I think it comes back to, like I said, the word digital gets thrown about and has different meanings for different people. In fact, my boss, the deputy minister, told me recently, he goes, I'm just going to ban the use of the word digital because it's confusing. And it doesn't just mean IT, and it doesn't just mean business. And you need to. So all domain comes with a bit of that stigma. It's a term that gets thrown about, and the translation between an armed force and a public administration. Our job is to try to glue that together. So we know, because we work closely with the armed forces, we kind of know what they want and what they mean when they say all domain, command and control. It's being able to make sure that our political masters gets the value proposition of what all domain means. And so as the implementer, we're the glue in the middle. And so we're there trying to make sure that the point's not lost. Like, you can get lost when you say the word digital. It's not just IT. It's kind of the same. I'm finding the same with all domain. The definition, the understanding, the clarity around it needs a bit of focus. And so conferences like this are excellent opportunities to vocalize, to talk about it in public fora, to share views and opinions, which is why I think it is a great question. The journey for us, like I said, it started years ago. We had a Vice Chief of Defense Staff who decided to make a recommendation to our Chief of Defense Staff that we need to be a digital armed forces. And we were lagging behind our allies, and we needed to get on with it. And that started the conversation. It created the Office of the Consolidated Combat Systems Integration that I mentioned. It started a conversation around a digital transformation that the department, the institution itself, wants to take on board. Like many institutions right now, they're looking at just better ways to deliver their business, and our business is the support of the Canadian Armed Forces. The conversation today is going to go on and on about different views on what all-domain awareness, all-domain command and control really means. So I'm as much listening as I am speaking about it. From the Canadian perspective, we haven't been very all-domain, right? We've been very kind of stovepipe domains. And so the Army knows what's going on in the Army, and the Air Force knows what's going on in the Air Force. We support all of them, but they're not integrated. There's not an enterprise view of all that. And so starting incrementally, and I find, just to segue a little bit into where we are today, just post-pandemic, we learned a lot about ourselves going into the pandemic. We learned how to pivot quickly, which is not our stereotype. We got into a cloud environment and started collaborating within months of the start of the pandemic, something I thought would have taken us years. But what it taught us about ourselves is that digital is not as hard as we thought. And now that we've got a taste of it, I think this journey for all domain, we need to remember that is not as hard as we think if we break it down into incremental achievements. We did a great project that to me was an eye-opener for all domain with NORAD. It was called Pathfinder. It was a bit of a pilot project where they used open source data to reenact some events that had occurred in the airspaces around the US and Canada. And it was post-mortem, so it was after sort of something would happen. I think the anecdote was there was a rogue plane, took off from Seattle, flew for a couple hours, and eventually landed. When they reviewed the data that was available to them, when they had time and had the compute power available, they saw the analogy develop, and then they realized the extracurricular flight path that was right in front of them, and very easy to see, would have been very easy to detect within seconds if they had all domain awareness and had the ability, the compute power, the data, the confidence to make a decision at that point. It proved to us that this is achievable. It needs digital, and it needs a new way of thinking about solving that problem, as opposed to the old way of waiting for somebody to call in, call the help desk, there's a problem, and then we know there's something going on. This is a very aggressive, modern way of looking at all the available data. One of the things I would challenge some of our panelists today is all domain. We typically think of our military domains, the sea, air, land, space, and now cyber. Think about open source. Like, that's another domain where the data is harder to verify. So if there was a way to qualify it, it's very powerful. One of the areas I've been interested in lately is sort of open source cyber offense. Let that sink in for a minute. And if you're on Twitter, you'll see what Unanimous is tweeting all the time about how they're involved in the Russia-Ukraine events, and they're doing cyber offense. And how does that play into our cyber forces? Because like the U.S., we have cyber command and we have cyber abilities and we do cyber defense and cyber operations, but we're bound by policy and we're bound by law sometimes. Open source cyber offense. It's a new digital equity that we need to be aware of. So in the data space, it's kind of the same equity. There's open source data that we can benefit from. We just need to learn how to pick it up, clean it, and trust it.
It's getting more complicated and complex.
You can only imagine.
Yeah, Terry, I would like to get, given your background when you were at both DOD and Navy, what's your perspective where the U.S. is, if you don't mind answering that?
I think the U.S. and our close allies are ahead of other forces. But where we are, I think, really struggling, and I think that Len nailed part of that, is how do you define all this so that everybody can play the same way? You think about just trying to get, say, a multi-domain set of solutions in one service. But what we really want is a multi-domain set of solutions that's good not just for the U.S. and our defense forces, but for Canada, the U.K., Australia, Germany, Japan, and then throw in what a harder part is this. We are, in today's geopolitical world, kind of introducing new allies into things that may not have been traditional allies. How do you do that and still maintain kind of the base level of security that you need to do? So we're adding a lot of complexity at the very same time that one of the key tenets of multi-domain is take complexity out of the system. So it is this, and that's where I think we are in the U.S. and I think with our allies. I think that's the big struggle now. How do we start removing this complexity? And particularly, how do we get the complexity out at the tactical level so that tactical commander gets finished product, gets what he needs, and isn't worried now about where the data came from in terms of verification. Somebody's taking care of that for him. And it's in a format that the tactical commanders from all of those allies can use and share with each other with the same understanding.
That's wonderful.
That's going to be hard.
Did you want to add anything about how you're working with allies for the U.S. or beyond?
Yeah, well, so Canada, and we've talked about this, our armed forces is not as large, or the bench is not as big as some of our allies. But I've heard through the grapevines that we typically punch above our weight. And so that's good to hear. As an enabler and an implementer, I'd like to hear that when we do send our forces out to be part of a coalition, that they're well equipped and they perform at their best, and they do. We've never unilaterally deployed alone. We've always deployed in coalition. We've always been part of a team. And so Terry's right. The ability for us to share, interoperate is essential. And in fact, Terry's a founding member of a CIO forum when he was a CIO at DoD. And for the first time, the 5 CIOs of the Five Eyed Nations would get together, like we do at NATO with the 30 nations, but a more concise conversation around the table of 5 countries that started sharing intelligence generations ago. And it became very, very powerful for us to make sure we don't develop platforms and capabilities that actually can't communicate with each other or can't share. And that comes back to data, and it comes back to our data strategies being, interoperable and coming from the same place and with similar requirements. One thing I learned with that forum was, regardless of size of budget or size of force, we all had the same problems. And a lot of them were, policy and administrative, and we shared how to break through some of those barriers. It's a very powerful forum, and I think it's a force multiplier for the CIOs of those nations. I just came back from NATO. I can't tell you how much energy there is in that institution right now, given everything that they're participating in and how they're handling it. On the technology side, NATO nations are very receptive. And we had partner nations in this time who are not NATO allies, but they want to be a part of the conversation. So Japan and Australia joined us for a day and talked to us about their cyber strategies, their 5G initiatives. These are great conversations to have. And so being a part of a global team feels a lot better than being sort of, a force on its own. And I say it in jest. I don't want to insult anyone in Canada, but I have a lot more in common with my CIO colleagues from defense departments than I do sometimes with my own government CIOs, just because we share problems and solutions that are very unique to a defense environment.
I'd like to welcome retired Major General Bob Wheeler and welcome back Terry Halvorsen for the second half of this special edition.
Bob, I wanted to get your perspective with your work in the Air Force and especially with B-2. How did you get data to the warfighter? What was some of the stories you can tell us about that?
Well, I think from my perspective, data is the key to staying inside the decision loop of the bad guy. It always has been. So the key in a lot of places is, you see movies like Top Gun, and we watch that, and it's all about the pilot, and it's all about the capabilities of that aspect to it, and being able to be, being the stick and rudder skills in that. That's a piece of it. But the reality of it is, it's really about owning the data on the battlefield. And sometimes I don't think people realize how critical that aspect is to stay inside of the decision loop. If you think today about all the things that are on the move in the battlefield, imagine they're moving all the time, constantly. How do you find them? How do you know where they're at? How do you know the intent of the bad guy? Well, all of that's given to you in data. So in a case like the B-2, for example, it's an incredible aircraft. Nobody else in the world can make it. It's manufactured in a way that has such tight tolerances. It has the stealth capabilities, and it has the best pilots, and it has all of the capabilities that you would think of a modern airplane that would have. But the issue that made it the most capable is the fact that we added a lot of data capabilities to it, so that data could be brought to the aircraft in a way that was ahead of everybody else, that gave us the edge, that allowed us, especially after 9/11, we're the first ones into Afghanistan and Iraq, some of the longest combat missions in the world, and all of that was provided by basically systems that were built and provided by the warfighters putting together for that particular area of the world the kind of data that was necessary. So bottom line to it was, we had the data first, we had it merged, we had it on our screens, and it gave us an insight and where to go and how to make those decisions faster than anybody else could. And that was the key to the fight, having that large bomb load, that stealth capability, and having the data. And so I think people don't realize how important that is today, to merge highly classified data off of really exquisite platforms, but also that unclassified data that could come from social type apps out there that you would take as, well, that's not good data. Well, it can be. It can be pointers. It can be information. How you merge that, how you bring that together, that is the key to staying ahead of the bad guy in any future fight, whether it's a counterinsurgency or strategic against a near-peer competitor.
Well, I think what Bob just described, what he was able to accomplish with his team and some of the other members of the Air Force, is it really becomes a microcosm of what we're trying to do on a much more larger scale with JADC2. So, if you can get that data, as they were able to do, to the pilot in a format that didn't overwhelm them, frankly, in a format that complemented what the plane did, and gave them the data. I hate to use this expression, but I think in this case it's really, it gave them the data just in time for their mission set. How do we do that now on a more global, and when I say global, we talked this morning with Len Bastien, who told us all about how critical it was that all our allies are playing in this, because we don't go to war alone. And I think if we could duplicate what Bob was able to do in the B2, that will get us the right answers.
I have a follow-up question, but I want to, if we can step back a little bit conceptually, we have multi-domain command and control, and we have the joint all-domain command and control. Are they the same thing? Are they different? Is there a maturation? Could you help us with the definition for a lay audience?
Okay, so we're good at definitions in DoD, and sometimes we don't follow them very well. I'm going to make this simpler, and Terry can add to it. So Joint All-Domain C2 is the ability for us to merge, if you will, space, air, and terrestrial layers of communication, C2, pictures, everything, into a fabric that is resilient, that is secure, and provides the right data at the right point. The multi-domain C2 that we just talked about, multi-domain command and control, is a subset of that. In my opinion.
Great.
I look at it as a subset, and it's a service subset. The joint all-domain C2 encompasses the whole joint force. The multi-domain C2 can contain multi-domains, but it can be service-specific or it could be joint, but joint all-domain C2 always means the larger picture in that particular case. Terry, would you like to add anything to that?
The only thing I would add, that is absolutely true if you're looking at the U.S. picture.
Okay.
In Europe, multi-domain really does mean JADC2, because they don't have the same structure. Most of their militaries are maybe more orchestrated together. You know, they don't have the same, say, separation of services that the U.S. has. So the reason we put joint in it is to just keep emphasizing we're going to have all our services talk. Europe, multi-domain, and what they're really interested in is the multi-domain of all of the countries, say in NATO, playing in there.
The largeness of our services, the competition that goes on, it's really why you have to have something large like a joint all-domain C2 to be the over-architecture that kind of joins all of this together. Honestly, it's a platform as important as the F-35, as an aircraft carrier, or as any other thing that's in any of the services. The platform that we're doing with JADC2 will be whether we win or lose the next fight, unequivocally. That's
my next question, is how important it is to the success of the future military right now. So my other question is, what about challenges? What are some of the challenges you faced in your previous role with B2 as an example, with that anecdote? And how did you work around those or tackle those challenges?
I'll just say what I see is the continuing challenge. How about that? Is that a fair point? Yeah. So the continuing challenge I'm seeing is the timelines of the acquisition processes and the pace of the threat. The pace of the threat is much faster than we've ever seen. I'll give the example of China, for example, where we've seen their ability to build things at a pace that we've not predicted. Always wrong. We've always been behind the 8 ball in that particular one. And that's just one example across the world in that particular arena. So the point that you have to realize is that you have to think about, okay, what's the timeline we're working at? You'll hear discussions of 2030. We don't have that time. We have to do things inside of 24-month delivery times to the warfighter in the field built. So what does that mean? That means that while those forces are deployed or in different locations, we have to be upgrading them. We have to do this differently than we have in the past, okay? And there's absolutely capability to do that today. And I think the acquisition authorities that we have today, I know, allow us to, if they're done correctly. They're designed for this scenario. It's just not something we're used to doing. It's not something that we've done traditionally in the past, and especially something of a platform like this, which is a set of networks, a network of networks that provides this JADC2 platform. It's the perfect capability to provide that delivery at speed to the warfighter in 24-month or even better increments.
I think that's exactly right. We've got to be able to say, well, it may take you 2030 to get the full concept of what we ideally want as today's JADC2, with the full knowledge, as we talked this morning, JADC2 won't end. So whatever we think we're going to have in 2030 today will not be what we have in 2030. We've got to be able to do this more incrementally and do it faster. And I think Bob's right. I think 24-month increments are realistic given the authorities we have today and given where technology is, and roll that out. And we don't need to wait to roll out the final solution. Let's roll out hey, what we've got today, move that forward, get the next 24 cycle, roll that out, and know that one of those cycles we're going to start to roll it out, and that change is going to hit, and we're going to say, oh, back up. We're going to roll out this new technology.
Taking Terry's comment that he made today, he said that more cycle, it's gone. It doesn't exist anymore. So if you take that context alone, how could you provide something in 2030 that would be relevant if you're working on it today? You have to provide it every 24 months because you have to continually update it, or you'll never stay inside the decision loop of the bad guy. There's no way.
And I would say as importantly, you won't stay inside the technology loop either. Now, DoD does not need to be extreme cutting edge in everything, but it needs to be modern. And I would say that means you've got technology that in many cases that's less than 3 or 4 years old. Well, to keep that, you've got to augment that every 24 months. And it is something that we're getting better at, but it's that you've heard a lot of you in the conference say about culture change.
That's what I was going to get to.
Yeah, this is a culture change. It's a huge culture change because it's and for some good reasons. I mean, we've put a lot of things in our acquisition cycle for good reasons. And now we've got to take a little risk with some of those good reasons because of everything that's happened in the environment, faster technology, faster threat. Time has become the higher risk, and that's a culture change for us.
It's a fascinating comment that Terry said because I agree with him on the leading edge. What is kind of cool, though, about the new technologies, they allow us to do this while forces are deployed. They allow us, because industries had to do it that way. Exactly that. And it's actually, in many cases, cheaper. And it's a way to save taxpayers money and provide them better capabilities, more resilient and more secure. That's an opportunity that we need to grab a hold of. And that's going to mean a different mindset culture to go forward in that particular arena. So I think this is the opportune time for what I would call Western ingenuity, which I still think is the best in the world. And I really believe that that's the one thing that our culture in the West provides better than any group I've seen. And using those and not governing them, if you will, or not slowing them down by rule sets, but actually moving forward so that the warfighter gets the best capability as fast as possible, as cheap as possible to the taxpayer. Balancing those two is really possible in the JADC2 environment. And I think it's kind of neat.
Well, I might just change Bob's word a little bit. Instead of saying Western, I would say democracy, democratic culture.
Oh, that's a fair point. I meant it. When I think of those, I think of the democracies of the world. Yeah, it's a very fair point because those are our coalition partners and our allies.
Be sure to join us next time for another informative, insightful, and in-depth conversation on improving government leadership and its effectiveness. Until then, subscribe, download, and listen to the entire interview at Podcast One, iTunes, or on your favorite podcast app. And as always, at businessofgovernment.org.